Let me tell you the story of Jakub, who was 18 months old when he died. He was suffering constipation, so his mother rushed him to a hospital. They were overlooked, not treated well, in fact not treated at all until it was too late and Jakub died. We told his story to our audiences in a podcast form, not to shock them, but to once again open a debate about the need to reform healthcare in our country. You didn't have to see me or read an article or watch an emotional video to understand what was this about. I simply told you a story. You listened.
So, can you hear me? Okay. So, that was something we do daily. Daily we tell stories, and we tell stories in the form of podcasts. So, just to be clear, is there anyone who's listening to a podcast? Any podcast? Okay. Is there anyone doing a podcast? Oh, cool. Okay. Is there anyone who doesn't know what a podcast is? Okay. Slide number 20 is for you. I come from Slovakia, and I wanted to show you somehow like how, when I'm talking about a revolution, like what does it mean, a revolution? And I thought like I have two images which show it like fairly well. I think it's a bit self-centered, but yeah, journalists are a little bit self-centered. So this is not me. This is our host of the daily news podcast, which we do, and this is how we started out. Less than a year ago in Slovakia. We had a TV studio, and when we said like we're gonna do a podcast, go into audio and just like, try it out, we started in the TV studio. And a few months later, it's on. Oh, okay. So a few months later, this is how it looks. So we have a podcast studio. We're doing not one, but several podcasts, but I'll get to it. So I have to show you this. So this is actually like what happened in Slovakia. And you're going to think about it like, what happened in 2017? Like, what's going on there? So, we started doing a podcast. We started talking about audio journalism, and 1 year later, or a few months later, actually all the news media in Slovakia, TVs, radios, our competitors starting doing a podcast. Either they took their videos and translated them into podcasts. Not hard, you can do that right away. And I'm glad that some of them are producing also original podcasts. So we started doing the podcast in 2017, October. I have to give credit where credit is due, and we were like heavily inspired by the US podcasting scene. So the Daily is a podcast by the New York Times, a daily news podcast. They launched it, I think, 2017, sometime in January. And Up First is a podcast by NPR, which is a public broadcaster in US. And so we were heavily inspired by this, and I have to show you the next slide to understand what really happened. So I hope is there someone from Apple here? No? Okay. This is not an ad, okay? But just to explain to you what's going on. So we are here people from Europe and all over the world. But in Europe, you might know that the main smartphone device are Android-based, so not iOS. So I mean, not iPhones. iPhones are roughly like up to 20% of the market. The same in Slovakia. But so what happened? So we needed to somehow persuade our leadership of the newsroom to do a podcast, and they had to listen to a podcast. So one of our deputy editors finally, after months of persuading, bought an iPhone, and suddenly it was really easy for him to listen to podcasts, because on an iPhone you have the podcast app, and it's really easy to subscribe to a podcast, listen to a podcast. So he started listening to these podcasts, and he said like, because like it's it's a really, really simple idea. You just sit down to journalists. They already are producing these stories, and we just record them, put them out, and nothing, not rocket science. So we said, okay, we will start an experiment, and we will do a daily news podcast. So we started doing a daily news podcast. What does it mean? Just to give you an overview. 2 people sit down, talk about the most important story of the day. We record it a day in advance. So what day is today? Today is Wednesday. What time is it? Roughly 5 p.m.? Okay, so by this time, we already recorded the episode for tomorrow. So there's obviously a delay, and if something happens after 5 p.m. or 6 p.m., we actually won't catch it. But that's okay, because there's another day coming. So we started doing this it's 15 to 20 minutes a day. And after a few months, we added more podcasts. Because the idea is you find out that once you start doing a podcast and people start listening to one, they start discovering and they start to know oh, I want more of this. So it's I always say it's a little bit like a drug, You just give one, podcast to people and they will just give me more. So we went from 0 to 4 hours of audio production in 1 week. So we're producing 4 hours of audio now. And we actually want to, produce even more. So we have a technology podcast, science podcast, about healthcare, about economics, business, cars, and we will be adding more because people want them. And Tassos, before me in the morning, he talked about new ventures, news media. And Mary Lipinski, she talked about slow journalism in 1 word. 2 words, okay. Tina Rosenbank talked about solution journalism. And in my view, podcasts are the solution when all this is brought together. Just to be, So, just to give you an overview, who's listening to podcasts. We have a really good audience, and we asked them to fill in a survey. So we actually had we have data from hundreds of people, and we gathered them, and we have seen what people see in the US when they do such research, that young, highly educated, and the audience is extremely engaged. Why I say it's extremely engaged, do I have data for this? Yeah, I have, and I'll show it to you later. So where do people listen to podcasts? At home. The first podcast we launched, it's called Dobré ráno in Slovak, which means good morning. And guess what? People are mainly listening to it in the morning. And what do you do in the morning? You brush your teeth, you wake up. So people started telling us, oh, I'm listening to it in the morning. Of course, we see on the data, on the stats, that most of the listeners download the podcast, listen to it in the morning. The next place where they listen to it is during commute. So on the bus, in the car, and they were actually sending us, emails and comments like, "Oh, guys, my journey to my job it takes 25 minutes. Could you do the podcast every day, just 5 minutes longer?" And we said "Okay, but there are other people whose journey to work is 50 minutes. We can't really just do a specific podcast for you, but maybe we will add more podcasts." So we added, and obviously it works. When we have those weekly shows, so we have the daily shows, weekly shows, and people sometimes listen to the weekly shows in one go. So they listen to a 30 minutes or 60 minutes podcast in one go. But of course there we see that people are listening to it when we do a weekly tech podcast, and that's being listened to in parts. So every day you listen to it for 15 minutes, and by the end of the week there's a new episode, and so on and so on. And at work, so we were really happy about it. I'm not sure if the employers are really happy about it, that we are taking half an hour of their employees' time, but I hope it's okay, because the magical thing about audio and podcasts is you can do something while you're listening. So you don't need to take your smartphone and watch the video. you don't need to read the text. You just plug in the earphones and you go. You do whatever you want to do. So you ask, actually you didn't, but I'll tell you anyway. Where do people, or how do people listen to podcasts? So to our podcast, people listen mainly on our website, which is amazing. So we have a pretty strong homepage. SME, where I work, has the number one news website which people visit every day. And we have found out, like, we dedicated a spot on the website where we publish the podcast episode in a form of article with an embedded audio player. And there is actually a really huge number of people who come every day, open the article, and play the video. So that's the 20% of the people who are listening at work. They told us, we know this, and we see this in the stats. Number 2, Apple Podcasts. And this is actually really amazing, that even though the audience, like the people who have iPhones, is really small, it's like 20% of the population. It's so strong. So you see that the technology can really drive this format forward. Spotify, number 3. So people already have this app in their mobile phones. They're listening to music. And Spotify is actually pushing podcasts more and more. So there is an ad campaign in Brazil where Spotify partnered with the biggest podcasters, and there are like big ads in the underground saying like, oh, you have Spotify, okay, there's good music, but of course there are also podcasts. You should listen to podcasts. So it's really nice that these tech platforms are pushing this format. It helps the whole ecosystem. And number 4, Google Podcasts. Finally, Google is going all the way in for podcasts, I hope. And it's like the listenership is skyrocketing. Okay, so I'm not being paid by Facebook to tell this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. So we have a Facebook group called Podcast Club. Of like Deník SME. There are like roughly 1,000 people there, so it's not a big group, but it's a very loyal audience. It's our like hardcore, listeners, and it's the best thing we could have done. We started it like when we started publishing the Daily News podcast, we started the Facebook group, and we are getting constant feedback. We are talking to the people about the topics, about the daily episodes. We're talking to people like, okay, so we have now these podcasts. What other content do you want? What other podcasts would you like? Who do you want us to interview? So it's really and it's amazing because when you are a big news media, when you are working in a big news media, it's like a corporation, and people see you that way. So and mostly the people who engage with you, like on our website, within the articles, in the comment section, it's mainly people telling us we are doing everything wrong. And somehow this Facebook group, or it's a place on the internet where people thank us. People tell us like, oh, you are doing a great job. And actually, all of our journalists, the whole newsroom is like part of this new Facebook group, and you can see they're encouraged by this. So I strongly recommend really, really deeply connecting with your community, and it was said before here. Just like say it again. So why do we do podcasts? Why do we still do podcasts? People want to listen to them. To give you some numbers. We are reaching monthly 250,000 listens, downloads, whatever stat you want to translate it into. That means we have almost 10,000 daily listeners, and that's when you've seen the first stat. That was from maybe 100 people listening, 200 people listening daily, jump within a few months to 10,000. So it's growing rapidly. So it's our I would say in Slovakia, it's the fastest growing new media platform, and it's not new. It's like more than 20 years old. So podcasts are nothing new, and still we can talk about it like an innovation. So people are listening. More people are listening. We are reaching 40 to 50,000 people monthly, and as I said, it's still growing. For us, it's of course a new platform, but for us, it's a way of distribution. So distribution, a new way of distribution of our journalism, of something that's already being created in the newsroom. We just translate it in a little bit different form. And as I said, it's slow journalism and solution journalism. It's not strictly solution journalism, but we go deeply in the topic. When you talk with someone for 15 minutes about one thing, what happened, you go from the really beginning to the really end, and you try to find some of the things like how this helps me, or what are the next steps. So there are two journalists who are really connecting over this topic and trying to dig deep, explain the news. So yes, that's something. Obviously, we wouldn't be doing it if it was if it wasn't sustainable. As I showed you the podcast studio which we built, we were able to do that because advertisers paid us for ads within the podcast. Actually, what we found out, when you put an ad into a podcast, no one cares. People have the ability to to jump in all of the podcast app, but they do not do that. They listen to the ads. And what they told us is, you've got radio, right? In radio, you hear the ad, one ad, like constantly repeating, going all around. And people told us, like, we don't mind ads, but if you're doing ads, like, try to do it like maybe the same ad, but like with different words, so just like not to get repetitive. Which was interesting to hear. Like, they didn't tell us, like with display ads, which are on our website, we hate them. No, they tell us like how to make them better, and so that they can enjoy it within the format. And they know that it's a way for them to somehow contribute to the whole thing. New audiences. Actually, as I told you, we're reaching young audiences. More than half of the audiences are up to 35 years, so it's young people with smartphones. And what we are hoping to do, and what we actually see, they are becoming our future digital subscribers. So we have a digital paywall, and we say for good journalism, you have to pay. We can discuss this later. There are different forms of like how you do it, but this is how we do it at SME. And what we've seen, when you ask people, please support this podcast, and you can support it by, buying a digital subscription. We had a special link, we had some stats, and we have seen like people really typed in the URL which we said out loud, and they actually bought the subscription, and then they went to the Facebook group and they told us like, yeah, I want to support you. I bought it, and I bought it like the longest possible way for 1 year with a 1 year recurrency. This is an amazing stat. We don't get this on our website, on our articles, on our videos, on nothing else. Like 90% consumption on average. So it basically says like people, once they start listening to it, they go all the way, like from beginning to start. And it does not matter if the episode is 12 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, or we do some specials, 30 minutes. So they just don't care because they are used to it. They just love the format. This is something I really love. The BBC has put out a cheeky list of the commandments of podcasts. And for the gentleman in the third row, a podcast is not a radio program, though a podcast can be in the radio. This is online, actually. You can find it. What I love about this is BBC is pushing for podcasts, as do more news media in the world, and they have this new app called BBC Sounds, and they are commissioning for new programs, new podcasts, and they actually wanted the people who applied to do really good podcasts. So they said like, okay, we're going to help you. We're going to tell you what is a podcast, who is listening to a podcast. That is audiences. You got to be informal. You got to, have a narrative or have a good story to tell. Yes, podcasts are a visually powerful form of audio. So what's next for do I have to finish? Oh. Okay. I'll just have 2 more slides and I'll be finished. So what's next for podcasting as some more wise people see it than me. So there is a giant hole in the content for podcasts, and its relative paucity is surely one of the biggest barriers to faster adoption. What that means in layman's term is that, as I told you, once we introduced podcasts to our audiences, they wanted more. And for more people to listen to podcasts more, you gotta have more audio, more content. Obviously, the content needs to be good quality, good content. So that's why we're slowly building up our. When I joke, I say the podcast empire in Slovakia, but obviously others are catching up, which I'm extremely happy about it. And the best way when you see something is catching up is that you've got these little independent podcasts popping up. So they're 2 girls in a really small town near Bratislava who are doing a podcast of their own, just interviewing their friends. There's another podcast. There are 2 Slovak girls around the world. One is in Australia. Second one is at the moment, I think, in Italy. And they every week they call each other, and they are travelers, travel hackers, and they do a podcast about traveling. And these are independent podcasts, so no one is behind them, just them. And you really see people really interested into that. So we are still talking to everyone what is a podcast. Almost daily I get someone and I have to I want to explain to them what is a podcast. And it's not only the audiences. Obviously you want the podcast to be sustainable, so you have to explain to the agencies, to the ad agencies, to the companies what it is, what is a podcast, why you should advertise with us, why you should start your own podcast. So there's a lot of this going on. And explaining to them what are the stats. That's why we do publish every month all the stats we can get from all the podcasting platforms we can get our hands on for our podcast, just to show our colleagues in other media this is how it is growing, this is how people are listening, this is the content which they are interested in. And I think that really helps, the transparency also in the numbers, and just explaining that this is a thing. And I think it helped in Slovakia because more and more people, journalists, are starting doing podcasts. Although we're talking about podcasts, when you talk to someone who does not know what a podcast is, maybe it's better to talk about shows, talk shows, there's this great show I'm doing, or there's this great show I'm listening to, because when you use the word podcast, it's a little bit technical. Just to know there. And obviously people want to listen. So when you talk about podcasts, talk first about listening. Try this, not go at them you should subscribe, because with the word subscription comes this notion that it's paid for, and mostly the podcasts nowadays are free, supported with ads, or if you subscribe you get some extra content. And I'll shut up.